Hello everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back. I hope that you are all doing well. This is where I talk about the books that I'm reading. I like to read a lot of diverse books and I highlight Canadian literature. If you are new to my channel, thank you so much for checking it out. Please hit subscribe and stick around. It would be great to have you here. Today I am going to be recommending 10 fantasy books that I have really enjoyed. So these recommendations are, I would say, especially for readers who may not like fantasy, because if you've watched my channel for a while, then you already know this. You know that I don't tend to read a lot of fantasy or science fiction books. And you probably know that, obviously I read Canadian literature as a Canadian booktuber. I read fiction, I read nonfiction, but rarely do I talk about fantasy or sci-fi. And I did a similar video to this, recommending 10 science fiction books. And I think in that one I mentioned that when I go into a bookstore, I don't really go into the science fiction or the fantasy sections. Even though I find myself saying I don't read sci-fi or I don't read fantasy, it's not really true. I may not read much of it, but it turns out that I do try both sci-fi and fantasy every now and then. And there are several books that I have really enjoyed in both genres. So sci-fi and fantasy books, they can have a lot of overlap. So some of these could already be considered sci-fi as well. But there are some differences. So the sci-fi books that I chose were more focused on science and technology. That might seem normal. Whereas these fantasy books that I'm going to share, they will have more of an emphasis on magic and supernatural elements, I guess. So sci-fi is more conceivable usually, as something that is possible and could happen in our own world. That part's important. Whereas fantasy may not be possible. We can like to think that it is though. And it usually has more world building. So there were actually quite a few fantasy books that I had listed that I've really enjoyed. I actually had way more than 10. So I may have to do a 2.0 version of these videos. So I think part of the success is that I have learned what kind of fantasy books that I like. What works for me and what doesn't. So when it comes to fantasy, I am not into vampires or dragons at all. Harry Potter has never really appealed to me. Please don't hurt me for that. Don't judge me. There's parts of it that I do like though. However, fantasy books really do, they've always captivated my imagination, especially as a kid. And the ones that I enjoy now, I think are similar to that. So for this video, I am going to focus on fantasy books. And these books, they aren't in any particular order. But these are all fantasy books that I've read and that I've enjoyed. So, as I said, as a kid, I loved several fantasy books, and stories. So maybe that's where I will start. And one of the first books that I remember devouring and feeling like I lived in it or that I wanted to live in it was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. I mean, this is classic, right? There was just something about that magical wardrobe and the magical place that it leads to. I just found it so captivating. And, you have magic and talking animals and mythical creatures. So it's also a story that as I got older, it continued to have more meaning for me. And I remember, all of the characters, eating the Turkish delight. It's such an interesting way to show good versus evil. So this is definitely like a classic that has, I would say, held up over time. Next up is a book that I talked about on the channel not too long ago, and it is Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. And I loved this story as a kid, and just the whole idea of pondering the whole notion of living forever and what that would mean. So this is the story of Winnie Foster, who comes upon a family, the Tuck family, and she finds out their secret. They have found the fountain of youth. Basically, that's what it is. And this story looks at the repercussions for them, but also like what would happen if others found out. And this year is the 50th anniversary of this book, and I just recently listened to the new audio that's coming out at the beginning of September. And I talk about this more in a video that I did on the 5 books about death, dying, grief, and bereavement. So I will leave that, linked below if you want to check out more of this and what I say about it. Another book that just captured my attention and my heart when I was a kid was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This story it's actually quite sad when it begins. Mary Lennox is the main character, and she's a young girl, and both of her parents die, and she is basically sent to live with her uncle. And what I would have always, when I think about it as a kid, I imagined it to be this grand estate, but dark and unwelcoming. And one day, as Mary is exploring, she comes upon a secret garden, and the garden offers hope and healing to Mary and to other characters in the story. So I love the imagination of this story and the development of, I'm going to say, all of the characters. It is really just a lovely story, and one that has always stayed with me. So sticking with the theme of gardens, I have another book that I adored from when I was a kid, that I don't hear anyone else talk about it, and that's Tom's Midnight Garden. This is by Philipa Pearce. And in this story, Tom is sent to stay with his aunt and uncle because his brother has the measles. So they're trying to protect Tom. And one night while Tom is laying in bed, he hears this grandfather clock that basically is another character in the book. He hears it chime 13. And when he goes down to investigate, he finds a magical garden, and things have changed except for this clock. The clock stays the same. And I remember a few things about this, but I don't remember the ending. I've tried to rack my brain, but I might read this again. There is a movie, and as a kid I watched the 1974 BBC film, and I will link the playlist below of those episodes. And then the film is like this, it's dark when you watch that. It's dark, it's not easy to see. some of the scenes, so just a heads up. But there is also a 1999 adaptation that I've never seen, but I will link it below. Yeah, I haven't seen that one yet. I just remember the old one, but I may have to watch it after I reread the book. So moving on now to a book that I read a couple of years ago, and it's The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. And I ended up really enjoying this book, like much more than I thought I would. I don't know why. I don't know what I was expecting, but the narrator is never named, and he goes back to his hometown for a funeral, and he ends up reminiscing about his childhood and his childhood friend Letty and what they experienced. So it's a bit of a coming of age story in a way, but it's also a story about imagination and childhood. And I would say that it's also about children overcoming living in a world when they're not taken seriously or treated well. And it has a charming element to it. This was my first Neil Gaiman book. And yeah, I'd like to read more by him if they are, like this in some way. So next up is a novella. It's Elevation by Stephen King. I loved the premise of this book. It is about Scott Carey, who is steadily losing weight without getting any thinner. So he's not changing physically, but he's losing weight. No matter what he does, every time that he gets on the scale, he's lost even more weight. So there is a side story as well, or maybe a parallel story, about Scott's neighbors who they have opened this restaurant in town, but they are not being welcomed by locals because the locals don't like their lifestyle. And I thought that this was a delightful little story. Like, I wish we had a bit more of maybe an understanding of what is actually happening with Scott. But I did like how community comes together because of him and what's going on with him. So if you're looking for a quick read, especially like this could work for Shorty September coming up, it is a very quick read, then I say go for it because I think it's worth it. Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir is next on my list. And if you've watched my video on the sci-fi books that I talked about, then you may know that Andy Weir made that list as well. I think he's the only author to make both lists. So this one could be for sci-fi or fantasy, but I'm including it on the fantasy list because this book takes place in space, and there, sort of his other book, but there is a character named Rocky, which is really my whole reason for liking this book. I adored Rocky, and Rocky is the reason the book, in my opinion, is more fantasy to me. And this is being made into a movie, and I can't wait to see it. For me, Andy Weir's stories are so much better as films, but I'm so grateful to him for his stories because they are very clever and funny. They're funny. I like how he uses humor in his books. So that's the next one. All right. This next book is a perfect winter fantasy read. And it's The Snow Child by Eowyn Ivey. And I just thought that this was a charming story. It's set in Alaska, which is where Jack and Mabel have moved to in order to kind of get away from things and start fresh in their lives. And they are both still having a hard time and grieving in some way. And so during this snowfall, the first snowfall, they go out and they build a snow child. So the next day the snow child is gone, but they see a girl and learn that her name is Faina, and Faina is enchanting. Everything about her feels fairy tale like, and she helps Jack and Mabel heal. And it's a book that really, I think, gives you a sense of place, or really like of winter, a feeling of winter, and yet it's also very heartwarming too. So, The Life of Pi by Yann Martel. I absolutely adored this book, which is set in India at the beginning of the story, but then it ends up basically on a life raft or a lifeboat for the rest of the time, I guess. So the main character is Pi, and his family has been running a zoo, and they decide to move to Canada. And when the boat that his family and the animals are on, it sinks, Pi survives and finds himself on this lifeboat with a tiger named Richard Parker. He then has to figure out how he is going to survive until they find land or are rescued. So this book is so imaginative and thought-provoking. It's such a great read. And it has stayed with me, for over 20 years at least. Also a great movie, although I would say read the book first in that case. So the last book that I want to mention, I have mentioned it actually a couple of times on my channel. It's a book that I've thought about many, many times since reading it, and I don't hear too many people speak about this author. But this book just has something unique about it, and it is, sorry, I'm holding up the wrong book, The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake by Aimee Bender. So if I remember correctly, I first picked this up on a whim, and while reading it, sometimes I'd be like, what the heck am I reading? And yet I was really liking it, at the same time. So this is about Rose, who from a very early age realizes that she can taste the emotions of the people who have made her food. And this is a strange and wonderful story. The characters are very interesting. Her brother, her mother, and eventually we learn that Rose's brother has a gift too. So this is just one of those books that I have continued to think about, and I'd really like to read more by Aimee Bender. I have, I think, a couple more books on my shelf by her as well. So these are the 10 fantasy books that I really enjoyed. As I said, there's many more, so we'll see what comes from that. You'll notice that there's no dragons or vampires or anything like that. So just, figuring out what works for me, and like I did with sci-fi, I've, done my best to try and figure out what works for me with fantasy, but I am willing to try different things as well. So usually if I stay within these kind of parameters, though, then I actually really, really appreciate fantasy. So please let me know if you have read any of these books, if you're interested in any of them. Do you enjoy fantasy? And if you do, then what are some fantasy books that you would recommend that I try or other people try? And then especially even if you're not usually a fantasy reader, maybe there's some that you have enjoyed that you'd like to recommend. So I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.